Oh my god.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to ArtiFact number 31. We're going to be discussing two films by the Japanese director Ryusuke Hamaguchi. And also just not just the films themselves, but what Ezekiel Yu has called a kind of Orientalist strain in some of the criticism of the films, which I also found myself. I also found some interesting interplay where these two films, which neither of us find very good, they do a kind of like a thing where there's almost a kind of both a self-orientalizing process that goes on, right? And also in a weird way, a kind of, I'm not sure if there's a word for this, maybe it would be Occidentalism, right? It's kind of like they're taking some of the maybe most trite aspects of Western conceptions of love, right? Especially like after, maybe the 70s and 80s, right? I think it's kind of coincidental that you start seeing a little bit of this in Japanese art, just right at the time when American influence was maybe sort of like reaching its, globalization peak. Anyway, first of all, automaticnation.com for all your literary needs. In fact, Zeke wrote two essays on these films, right? One on Asako I and II, and another one on Drive My Car. Both of these will be up by the time that you guys are watching this video. So if you want to see a kind of, much more formal critique of the films, you could find his essays on the site, patreon.com/automaticnation. If you want to support the work of this channel and the work of the website, my writing, other people's writing. And we're going to actually record a patron only after show after we do this discussion where I guess we're going to talk about objectivity and subjectivity in the arts, right? Zeke had some kind of like incipient ideas in all this that I've also been kind of thinking about at the same time. So we're just going to come together in formal discussion, but it's going to be a bit different from what we're talking about here. So if you want to check that out, only way to do it, sign up for the Patreon and you get tons of goodies. So anyway, Zeke, do you want to maybe introduce the director and the first film that we're talking about?
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't familiar with him before Drive My Car was released, and this was like I think it premiered at Cannes 2020. But he wasn't. He was sort of like a notable auteur name from Japan because he'd done, I think, what's it called? Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy, which I think was released the same year as Drive My Car. And then he did Asako I and II, and then he did a couple other films. But I think he was probably more famous in Japan than he was on the international scene. But then Drive My Car came out. It got rave reviews at Cannes. I think it dropped on HBO Max, where I watched it. Started winning a bunch of awards. And he's done like fiction features and he's done documentaries. So this isn't like his debut film, but I think you described it as his breakout, and that's what other people would describe it as, Drive My Car. But Asako I and II came out in 2018. And it's, I don't know, I think, like you said, I don't think it's a very good film. It's basically about this woman named Asako. She's this young woman living in, I think, Osaka?
Yeah, first we start with Osaka, then they moved to Tokyo.
To Tokyo. And I mean, the beginning isn't really promising. I think she's just sort of like wandering around this art gallery, and she happens upon this dude named Baku, who's a DJ. He's got like big hair, and he doesn't really talk. I think I described him as laconic and kind of like a tall, dark, and handsome, really brooding. And their sort of meet cute doesn't bode well because literally, like she sees him and she notices him and she sort of stalks him through the gallery. And then they meet outside, and then Hamaguchi frames them like it's sort of like an anime moment, and we could talk a bit about that too. they kind of look at each other, and across the distance and literally between them, like there's some kids setting off fireworks, and like sparks go off, and like
Yeah.
sparks fly between them, right?
Yeah,
So
it's fireworks
yeah,
while they kiss, right?
yeah, exactly.
It's
And
it's
then
it's that kind of moment.
he shoots his feet as he walks towards her, which is a shot that he repeats later on in the film. And then they kiss inexplicably, right? Like, I guess it's like love
Yeah.
at first sight, which is what you were talking about, how like those tropes, Occidental tropes, I guess, feature. And then
Let me
yeah,
just respond to that so far. So, first, like I heard about Drive My Car as his that was like my introduction to Hamaguchi, but I only
sure,
heard about it. I didn't watch it. I was looking at Criterion. I was like, all right, let's see what films of his are available on Criterion Channel. And I saw three films. One was like a 5-hour film. I was like, all right, this is a little too much to start with.
yeah,
Another was Drive My Car, which is 3 hours.
yeah,
And then the other one was Asako I and II, which was only 2 hours long. And I was like, all right, let me at least begin with Asako I and II. And also, like, it would be helpful that this is a script. He did co-write the script with someone else, but this is not unlike Drive My Car. It's not
sure.
based on like a Murakami story.
It is based
So,
off of a novel, I should say, but it's not a
it is
yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Yeah. All right. So, but in either case, I was just thinking, okay, I want, like, I just want to see what kind of like maybe like a lower stakes introduction to the work is like. I was like, all right, let me watch Asako I and II, and yeah, immediately, it was like this is very much kind of like an anime film, right? It's kind of odd because look at some of the characters, like first of all, Baku, right?
yeah,
So Baku very much looks like a protagonist from a Japanese
yeah,
RPG,
yeah.
right?
It's true.
So, he's
The
like this, like,
hairs, yeah,
yeah, tall, lanky guy with like
yeah,
the big fucking like spiky hair, right? Is very kind of like laconic, right? In the sense that like in a Japanese RPG, like you wouldn't be the one doing the speaking, right?
mm,
Oftentimes, the protagonist says nothing at all, and this is like so like this is the first kind of like oddly sort of like self orientalizing kind of feature. It's taking what is known as maybe like the most common elements of that part of like Japanese culture, and just kind of like really blowing them up and putting it in movie form, right? Which is like the
mhm,
odd part. Like I could imagine so much of this being like in a manga, right? Like the
yeah,
scene, for example, of them seeing each other from a distance across the fireworks, and the doe-eyed Asian girl just kind of standing there, completely awestruck, not knowing what to do next, right? Not knowing what the next moment is going to bring. And then the male lead taking the lead, right, physically with
yeah,
her. And just like with a lot of kind of like romance intrigues in anime and manga and Japanese RPGs, you also have absolutely no clue as to why any of these people would even be drawn to each other,
yeah,
right? Like so with Baku, right, you could sort of you could understand generically why women would be into him, right? He is tall, he is good looking, he is laconic, right? He has that artistic quality. He's also not very emotionally consistent, right? He
yeah,
could disappear for weeks or months at a time. The first time it's I'm going to get bread, and the second time he disappears is I'm going to go buy shoes, right? He just
yeah,
never shows up. And when you read some of the kind of summaries of the plot, right, like the summary would be something like and Baku says that he's going to buy shoes, and then they fall out of contact, and it's not actually falling out of contact. It's Baku doesn't care enough to actually
yeah,
like give his, whether it's like a cell phone or like anything, right? He just wants to sort of like wander his own way. So you could understand like that element of physical attraction, the same way that if a woman behaves that way, right? A lot of men, whether it's like the prototypical Woody Allen type that
mhm,
is drawn to very difficult women that are not emotionally available, right? So it's like it's not just like a male female thing, right? Both sexes are capable of doing that, but on her end, she has absolutely nothing going for her other than the fact that she's physically cute, right?
yes, yeah,
Like she's like she very much looks like an anime girl. And I say girl because I was surprised to find that in the film she's only 20 years old, actually,
mm,
like the actress, right? So very young. he's actually at that time closer to his 30s, and in the action of the film, like diegetically, like I think it's supposed to be at the very least mid-20s, like maybe even early 30s. And yet so much of the plot and so much of what happens and so much of the romance and the drama, it's something that would happen in a kind of like high school, like a high school
slice
sort of
of
drama
life type of thing.
Yeah, which is the thing. Like in a lot of these anime shows, like it's just looking at either junior high or high school, and it's the same kind of dramas. And it's very odd seeing this occurring, amidst like people that are in their 20s or even older, right?
We're like business people or court working. Well, she works at a coffee shop.
And that's the other part, right? Like, when she goes to Tokyo, she ends up in a coffee shop, and he ends up like in some sort of like faceless corporation. And that's like another like little kind of like a orientalizing feature. Like the cute Asian girl from the coffee shop like falls in love with the respectable nice guy that has like a corporate job, right?
Well, I guess we should say that the guy we're talking about is Ryohei, who after Baku basically abandons Asako. Like I think 2 years later, she moves to Tokyo. She's basically restarted her life there, and she meets Ryohei, who's basically like a doppelganger for Baku. He looks exactly like him, except he's got a haircut. And as like I say in the essay, if Baku's like the classic sort of like tall, dark, and handsome, he loves from a lofty distance, he doesn't really care for like Asako's emotional life, then Ryohei is the classic nice guy. He's dependable. I think I saw one reviewer call him a little bit dim, but like in a good way, like in a good natured way. But he's earnest, and he actually pursues Asako, as opposed to Asako constantly needing Baku's attention and presence. And so that's and it's called Asako I and II because I suppose there's Asako I who is with Baku, and then there's the Asako of her life with Ryohei. And that's the sort of like the central I guess metaphor of the film. I don't know how into the weeds of the plot we should go into, but it's basically detailing Asako's relationship with Ryohei and whether or not she actually is with him because of his resemblance to Baku and her nostalgia, and how much she yearns for whatever connection they had, which we don't really even see right in the beginning. Like we don't really get a sense of how they love each other, why they're so attached, apart from like the shallow elements that you described just now. And so, I mean, it's really just that. It's really just her working out whether or not she loves Ryohei for Ryohei, and not, which is it's very sort of cliche and saccharine, right? And it doesn't really elevate much beyond that.
Even the title, right? I actually thought the title, at least the English translation, I believe in Japanese, it's technically something like whether asleep, sleep or awake, which it doesn't. It's like a very kind of straining kind of title, right? It doesn't even necessarily fit all that well with the film. But to call Asako one and two, right? On the one hand, it's kind of like it mirrors the idea that there's Baku, then there's Ryohei, right? And it's the same person, and yet the emphasis really is on her and her responses to such, as opposed to the kind of like visual, kind of a conceit of the film, which is these two characters that are, it's the same actor, obviously, right? But they're different people. And I thought that was a good touch, but the reason why I can't call it like an excellent choice or whatever is because it doesn't actually, like the implication there is that, like you said earlier, it's supposed to be her transformation. It's supposed to, sort of examine her choices and her feelings, but it really doesn't examine those things in any substantive way. Right. To the extent that we could say that she changed from, early on to the film to 5 years later, which is about the span of the time that passes. There isn't truly a substantive change because you don't really get anything of her internal life, really, at any point in the film.
I mean, I guess you could say it's effective by way of its irony because,
Yeah,
like I say in
exactly.
the essay, it's like she's a completely static person.
Hmm.
Like in the film, like in the beginning, Asako one, when she's with Baku, she has a best friend, and then they meet up with Baku's relative slash landlord, and they have a little foursome where they're all hanging out. They're together. And then later on, when she's with Ryohei, she has a friend in Tokyo. He has a friend that he works with, and they form a little foursome. And so the idea that she is a completely static personality does not change. We don't really get a look into her interior life, and she kind of has to like these patterns sort of reemerge, and she has to surround herself with kind of like stock characters.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's effective in that way, I suppose.
Hmm.
In that it's ironic, but apart from that, yeah, we don't really get a good sense of who she is as a person. Um, she's just kind of vacuous and shallow, because she ultimately
Yeah.
later on she makes a decision to go with Baku, and which sort of reveals that she really was with Ryohei because
Yeah.
of his physical resemblance to him. So, but
And it's
yeah,
done in a very kind of like Little Mermaid way, right? Like
yeah,
Jessica's always hated Little Mermaid because of what Jessica Schneider, she says Little Mermaid is so has like all the wrong lessons for young girls, right? And
yeah,
here, she behaves kind of like the Ariel character, where she's at the engagement dinner, right, that she's
yeah,
supposed to be enjoying with her friends and with Ryohei, right? And suddenly Baku shows up. She immediately goes with him, and she texts from the car as they're driving somewhere far away north that she's never been in, with this like guy that's acting totally psychopathic. That's the other
yes,
thing.
yes,
He
exactly, yeah,
acts like so psychopathically, especially at that point in the film. And she's like going off with him, and she's like texting to her friend, give him our cat,
yeah,
and tell him to
clear,
throw out everything that I own.
yes,
Kind of like
yeah,
this,
yeah,
like that's the thing, like a total blank slate of a person, right? Your belongings don't mean anything. Like you've never accumulated anything in your life that you could have any kind of affinity for, any kind of attachment to,
yeah,
right? The people in your life you have absolutely no attachment to, just like a total blank slate of a character. There's this odd kind of mix of just kind of like flat out bad writing, in the sense of like
yeah,
it's straining for meaning. Like for example, like early on, where the first time that Baku disappears for like one night, but later on when she first meets Ryohei, who looks like Baku, and she's very surprised to see him, and she thinks that it's Baku, and she asks like certain things, and it's clear after a while that it's not him. There's this kind of at that point the writing shifts from just like flat out bad in this kind of like fake poetry sappy kind of thing, to it's just like bad in a purely mechanistic way, where like there was
mm,
like some like I think there was like something with his name that in Japanese sounds like the name of like some kind of exotic animal. And
okay,
she like says his name or something, and he's like
oh yeah,
he
yeah,
like
yeah,
he responds like,
I
oh,
remember, yeah,
the zoo. And then you see like later on he
yeah,
starts like pining for her. Then from his phone, he's like looking at pictures of tapirs,
yeah,
which he thinks that she called him a
yeah,
tapir. And then she's like, I look nothing like that. Like a total, like again, it's like very much, it's the kind of humor that you get from some of these like
sure,
manga books.
yeah,
And it's writing that is so like, it's so like forced, right?
sure,
There's nothing, there's nothing about their interaction that would naturally lead anyone to those kinds of conclusions about being
yeah,
insulted or like anything, but it just sort of happens just to make this totally unfunny joke, right? So there's like
yeah,
writing of those two types. There's the kind of like bad sort of like
yeah.
faux poetry and sappiness, and then
I guess
there's also
the
in the
most you
mechanistic
could
way,
say
just like yeah.
the most you could say about that is I think it parallels her, because when she meets Baku, like she goes on about his name, about, or I don't
Yeah.
know if he or mentions it or if she mentions it, but how Baku means wheat or
Hmm.
something, and then they have like a little conversation about that.
Yeah.
So maybe there's that sort of focus
Yeah,
on the
that's another
meaning.
thing. Like when I talk about these like self-orientalizing qualities, both of the films do this, where they have this kind of like passing fixation on the meaning behind this or that name,
Yeah,
which you can't really do obviously in like typical American names, right? Like nobody thinks like Alex. So yeah, is that after Alexander the Great? And then
Yeah,
start like, fucking off about like, Greek culture and heritage. Like people don't really
yeah,
do that. Right. And it reminds me of like early on, like the earliest like internet memes. One meme that was passing around was like, imagine if like Asian women would go around putting tattoos of English phrases on their arms, right? And
oh,
it would be something like it
yeah,
would be like this like very stereotypical looking like a Japanese lady, and then on her arm it says water, and it's like it just looks stupid, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
I mean
yeah,
it's the same thing here, right? This kind of fixation, like the meaning behind names, like that
yeah,
both films do this, and like I'm sure Murakami does this in his novels and his stories. Right. That's not to say that there isn't so much a place for it, but at a certain point, like there is this kind of like weirdly self-orientalizing feature, and I wonder to what extent this is taken from maybe some like Western fixations on this very thing,
right.
like about this very thing. um
I
so
spoke with Ethan a bit about Ethan Pinch of the
yeah.
New House. We were talking about Orientalism a little bit in preparation for this, and I think it comes from the famous Edward Said um, book, right?
Yeah.
Orientalism,
Yeah.
about the West and how it sort of um, exotifies, if that's a word, the Orient, which is I guess the old-fashioned word for the East or Near East. Um, and you see it a lot in art, right, with all the pictures of these sort of like the Turkish harems, right, or or certain Western visions of what Japan or China is like.
Hmm.
How it is a kind of demeaning or condescending take by sort of taking out these very sensational elements from the East and sort of like lavishly depicting it in art form or something to that. I haven't studied it. I haven't read the book, but in school everybody learns about it, right? I
Hmm.
have an English degree, and so we certainly talk about Orientalism. But like Japan, there is that sort of, like we said earlier, like a lot of early manga and anime is sort of like a what is it? If not Orientalism, Occidentalism, right?
Hmm.
How it sort of extracts very basic elements from the West and sort of transmogrifies it into its own sort of version of what uh,
Hmm.
they see the West as being. So it's like what Orientalism is. It just seems like just a common feature across all cultures. We all sort of, if it's a foreign, we look at
Hmm.
something foreign, we have to uh, transform it into something that's more comfortable in our eyes, or we repurpose it for our own purposes or vision. Um, so, and anyway, I just wanted to mention that because I spoke with Ethan a
Yeah.
bit about it, and
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I think that that's a proper way to do it. I mean, everybody does it to some degree. I mean, even to the extent that you'd be interested in like cultures that are like
yeah,
not your own, right? I mean, it is because like there is like, oh, there's something different about it. There's something like you are coming in with the expectations of some level of differences.
yeah,
And there's nothing, necessarily wrong with that. It's really just how it's treated.
yeah.
Um
We
I
all
and,
appropriate.
yeah, and
Yeah,
I do find it kind of interesting. So like both films, Drive My Car and Asako 102, they feature
Chekhov.
uh what?
Sorry, I thought were you going to go the Chekhov route?
Oh no,
Because they
well,
both
I mean
have Chekhov plays in it. Yeah,
they both feature Chekhov as a kind of
yeah,
a crutch, right? You need some sort of like thematic, baseline, I guess. But
yeah,
both of them feature female characters that are. It reminds me honestly a lot of like when me and Jill Parrish did that show. It was like one of the early artifacts on William Stoner's, or
yeah.
rather, William.
John Williams. Yeah,
Yeah, John Williams' book Stoner, and Stoner's wife has this like extremely animalistic quality. Like
yeah,
when she wants to have a child, that's it. She turns into this like animal,
yeah,
right? That's like wishing to be impregnated. And here, in both of these films, you have both Odo, the wife in Drive My Car, and here Asako and Asako 102 that also have very kind of like oddly animalistic drives,
yeah,
right? And on the one hand, like I want to say that it's kind of like orientalizing in the sense that when you look, obviously, like if you look at the kind of most extreme cases of how maybe like pickup artists or whatever talk about Asian women or like, Asian countries, there's definitely, like depending on where they travel, right? They try to assess, women as kind of like, pieces of meat, and how to unlock them, right? How to get them. But here they are sort of like behaving that way, like this kind of like highly reactive, like Asako has absolutely no internal life, only to the extent that Baku can imprint himself on her.
Yeah.
Right. She becomes kind of like animal, like literally dropping her entire life just to go randomly off with him somewhere where she's not even sure where the hell she's going.
Yeah.
And in Drive My Car, right, you have this, we're going to talk about this more when we talk about that film, but when Oto is like, she's like straight up, the only time that she's able to create art is when she's like on the edge of like some kind of orgasm. It has to be like mid-sex where she's like thinking of stories. And it's like, that's not how art works. Anybody that does any kind of art will know how absolutely off, like ridiculous that is. And I'm sure Murakami himself, right, when he writes stories like that, he's probably not, in the middle of orgasm while it's happening, right?
I would hope not. Yeah.
He's probably never seen this kind of behavior from women either, right? That's not how people behave, period. And yet, he wants to write female characters that are very animal-like and reactive in the sense, right? So,
well, I mean, there's that motorcycle scene, right, when they crash.
Oh yeah.
And then they crash and they're like on the floor prostrate. And I think you wrote in your notes how it could potentially be a good scene because they start, laughing.
Yeah. First they're laughing because they're like, oh my
the
god,
adrenaline is, exactly.
Yeah.
And then they start they're lying down on the road and they just start making out. Like, and she falls on top of him.
And that's the thing. Like the reason why the scene goes haywire is not even because they kiss. I mean, you could imagine someone, feeling like they might have just been dead, right? Oh my god, we're alive. They might, quickly kiss, but it becomes this extremely sexual kind of kissing that's like goes on, and like a crowd forms around gathers. Them. And that's like another symbol, like, oh my goodness, look, they're so oblivious to, they're so oblivious to the crowd around them because they're so in love. And again, given the fact there's absolutely no basis for this love, it just comes off as very, very cheap. So another interesting part is, so in Asako 102, there's this friend that Asako has early on, from Asaka. What is her name?
Haruyo, I think is her name.
Yeah. So and she's an interesting character because on the one hand, like you could tell that she's like petty and jealous in some respects, right?
Yes.
But and also like she's kind of like used as kind of like comic relief, right? Like Asako meets her after 5 years and she was like, oh my god, like you are, you look prettier somehow. And she's like, oh yeah, I had plastic surgery done, right? But although like she's like supposed to be like painted in a way, like that's the odd thing, like she's painted in a way where she's supposed to be kind of superficial, like next to the mysterious Asako, when in fact like Asako herself is the one that's actually very superficial. Whereas her friend is like, you shouldn't be with Baku, he's gonna just only hurt you. And then later on, when she realizes that she might only be with Ryohei because he looks like Baku, you could tell how alarmed she is. And then she tells her, like, when Baku shows up again randomly somewhere, she's like, don't go to see him, right? So she seems to be actually the very reasonable one, despite the fact that she's kind of used for comic relief. And the thing is, like, I would say normally under normal circumstances, oh, that's a good like writerly decision, right? That's a kind of like, that's an inversion of expectations, and that's good. But you for that to be good, you would have to also make Asako someone of any kind of substance, but because it's not there, right? That's kind of like me sort of seeing a technicality that in a different kind of artist's hands might actually have some payoff, but there's not anything actually that's happening here underneath.
Unrelated note, like a lot of reviewers mention how, or some reviewers mention how basically all the side characters come off as far more interesting and compelling than Asako. And yeah, that could work if Asako were someone of more depth, then there could be just a gallery of interesting characters and we focus on Asako, who but she's so empty and uninteresting that so much of the film focuses on her. We're left wanting more with these side characters. And like the actor, her actor friend, I think her name's Maya or something.
Yeah, Maya is an
Maya
artist.
in Tokyo, she's an actress, and she does the Chekhov play. And I mean, there's a, I guess it's somewhat interesting scene of them having a party, her and Ryohei.
I think that's probably
Maya.
that has the makings of like being the best scene of the film,
Yeah.
but that also just goes haywire, right?
Yes.
I mean,
Basically,
yeah. Go ahead.
oh yeah, I was just gonna set it up how, because Asako and Ryohei are just starting to get to know each other, so they planned this dinner date with him and his friend. I think what's his name? Kushihashi. I'm gonna butcher these Japanese names, but Kushihashi or whatever. His friend that he works with, and then Asako and Maya all have dinner together, and they watch Maya's performance of the Cheka. I think it's the seagull. And Ryohei's friend basically just completely roasts her performance, and they have this awkward moment.
Yeah. For first, he doesn't want to say anything, right?
Yeah, exactly. He makes an excuse.
He becomes
to leave.
critical. Yeah.
And he sort of awkwardly fumbles his way through a critique of her performance, saying it's like not it's like it's pandering to the audience, something to that effect. And then he performs his own Chekhov lines, and then it's revealed that he was an actor in a previous before. And then they have this thing where Hamaguchi has them work out that kind of awkward scene, that awkward moment. But then nothing's really done with it apart from
they enter a relationship.
They enter into a relationship, exactly. It's just to set up,
they become married and pregnant. Yeah.
And then they're sort of relegated to the side.
Yeah.
And then it just goes nowhere.
I thought it was an interesting scene, at least how it begins, because I mean, some of the critiques that he was making, right, are especially some of the kinds of critiques that maybe like it reminds me a little bit of some of the stuff that was said in that Trier film. It wasn't Oslo, August 31st. It was what was it? Oh, it was called Reprise. No, Reprise.
Okay,
yeah, Reprise. Right. Some of the kind of critiques of the arts or whatever was reminiscent of that. The fact that he says stuff like, "Oh, and I'm sure all your friends showed up and they gave you flowers and they said wonderful performance," right?
Yeah.
And I think there's something to that critique. It's interesting to hear, especially in a film like this. It's totally kind of unexpected. But yet it takes immediately this very kind of predictable route where, like, first of all, Asako to show how like Asako actually has like depth underneath it all.
Yeah.
Right. She's like, well, I was there and I did bring her flowers and I did
cried.
say that it was, I cried and I did say that it was wonderful. It actually did happen, as if like that's supposed to, obviate the actual critiques being made, which, it's kind of like, I mean, who cares that this was your response, right? Who cares that even this was reality? Right. So that's the first part, right? It's kind of like it's only like the scene is kind of like only used as an opportunity to create like a false depth for the lead character. Right. That's the first part. And the second part is to defang all this and to sort of like not push boundaries too much. And that kind of like awkwardness of that scene and how it gets resolved reminds me a little bit of like early on when what's her name, Haru, the first friend from Osaka, and like when she first sees Baku at that kind of restaurant, whatever that they're sitting, like the first thing that she like sees him kind of like like he's bad, you shouldn't be with him, blah, blah, kind of like totally inappropriate, like in any culture. I don't care if it's Japan. It's totally, not only is it totally inappropriate as a kind of introduction, but how extremely quickly, as if it like she sits down, it's as if she never even said that. Everybody returns immediately to normal. They start laughing about something unrelated. And like nothing comes of it, right? There's tons of moments where, just from purely kind of mechanistic perspective, the writing is just so unrealistic, like even beyond like the sappy stuff, like, but just like purely in a technical sense, like it's just, this comes absolutely out of nowhere.
I'm not the biggest anime guy. I mean, I've read my fair share of manga, but it all that just gave me that, like, I was watching some, like, there's even that goofy landlord dude who seems like a character out of some
I got something
anime,
about him as well.
It's like he's just this sort of like constantly joking, silly looking, immature dude. And there's that moment in the dinner what you were talking about where it's like nothing comes across as real.
Yeah.
Yeah, but anyway.
Yeah, yes. Speaking of that character, so I forget his name, but he's supposed to be the landlord or like a distant
Yeah.
relative of
Okazaki.
of Baku, right? And like yeah, he's definitely like he's portrayed. Another reason why like this Orientalist thing came up is, I mean, I see this all the time, right? It's maybe becoming a bit more subtle over time, but it's still there, and it becomes more overt depending on the context. So like we definitely have in America the stereotype of this kind of like sexless, effeminate Asian male,
Yeah.
right? That one very prominent thing recently in America was that guy Andy Ng, or rather Andy Ngo, I guess is how he pronounces his name. I always thought it was pronounced Ng.
NG.
Yeah, NGO.
NGO.
So this guy, he's like a total, like right winger. He says he's a journalist, but he kind of like made his fame just primarily reporting on Antifa Antifa protests in Portland. Like anytime there'd be like, some guy from Antifa or whatever getting like arrested, he would tweet out like a mugshot of this person.
The fascist left.
And what he would take upon himself is kind of like whenever he would do interviews with like Tucker Carlson or whatever, it would always be like he would show up like near tears, like, and then they threw a milkshake at me and there was cement in it. And then someone punched me in the face and I had to go to the hospital. And he's like always like, it's like a guy, it's a fucking guy, like always like on the edge of tears, talking about anywhere he goes out, he gets beat up. Anywhere that he goes, he gets beat up. Right. And the given the fact that, it's almost exclusively right wingers in his audience, right, who have racial grievances of their own, they do love seeing this totally sort of like beaten down Asian man whose only role is to be, like just play exactly that, right?
Yeah.
And so like this character in Asako I II, he's very similar. Like you say, he's like very goofy, he's very wacky. When he like takes Asako to like on the dance floor, right, when they go into this like club. Right. He's like, oh, you don't have to know how to dance. You could do whatever you want. And he does. And he's like dancing and sort of like having fun in a way where like it comes off as goofy, but like that most women wouldn't be like actually interested in.
Yeah.
And the next like substantive interaction of any sort that you see with him is like literally like he gets essentially killed off. Right.
Yeah,
this
he's a paraplegic.
Yeah. You see him as this, he's like, now laying in this bed and he's paralyzed. He gets killed off essentially in that sense, like symbolically. Sure. And she shows up to see him and she's sad. But all that she does is he starts talking to his mom and she just starts reminiscing about like Baku and about like Ryohei and she says like, oh my God, I feel like such a piece of shit, right? Even here, I can only think about myself when I came to see, my old friend who's now paralyzed. And his mother too, like just like starts talking about this. And it's literally like, like he's like, again, this totally sexless observer.
Sure.
His feelings, anything else, like it's all irrelevant, right? So again, it does strike me. I don't know to what extent this kind of character was sort of like, I'm sure there's always been a kind of stock character in Japanese art that was like supposed to be the sexless sort of like aromantic kind of comic relief guy, but I just notice this more and more because I see how this is specifically done to Asians in America. And I mean, I can't help but think that this is a similar kind of dynamic going on with this character.
Yeah. Well, they're all stock characters. There's the goofy sidekick. There's the tall, dark, and handsome dude who who fights this dude for touching Asako at the club, who's completely emotionally unavailable. And then there's the super nice guy who just wants the best for him, for Asako, and again, like probably the most interesting ones who show like the Maya and Ryohei's friend show more growth and like actual like chemistry and an actual dynamic where they learn from each other in that one scene than Ryohei / Baku and Asako show in the whole film.
Yeah.
If I would have watched a movie, I would have rather watched a movie about those two. Than Asako, but yeah.
I mean, like moving closer to the film, because I mean, not too much happens, right? So like 5 years pass, and
Yeah.
Ryohei. So well, first of all, before there's like another kind of anime like sort of a sequence where, although they're dating, Asako just like breaks it off suddenly because
Yes. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
because she does understand that a large part of her attraction to Ryohei is because of the fact that he reminds her so much of Baku. And he's like, again, like the typical sort of nice guy. He tries to sort of like insinuate himself more and more into her life, like, okay, you don't want to be with me, but I'm gonna get these tickets to see your friend in this play, and I'm gonna try to show up when you're there. And she doesn't actually show up, and there's like this earthquake that happens.
Yeah.
And because of that, for the rest of the day, the trains aren't working, so everyone is like walking home or whatever at night. And this like totally like anonymous crowd eventually, they're coming towards each other, right? It's Ryohei and it's Asako. They see each other at a distance, and the same kind of camera sort of angles you get at the
Yeah.
beginning with Baku, where it just emphasizes like their feet coming together. We see that, and that's the thing with anime. Like anime would often do that. That could be like potentially interesting. Like for example, like you sometimes see photographs by I can't believe I forgot her name, but the woman that she was a nanny, and
Oh,
she,
Vivian Meyer.
yeah, Vivian Meyer. Like for
Uh,
example, like you see a lot of photographs, it would be like the portrait would actually be an emphasis on like the bottom half of someone's like body, right, their legs or something, or the way that their feet look, right? And that's an interesting way of thinking of like portraiture, right? Like how can we focus on everything other than what is ostensibly the most important thing, which is supposed to be the face? And anime sometimes does that, but the problem with anime is it sometimes has like novel kind of techniques that are used to serve absolutely no actual higher purpose.
yeah.
And same thing here. There's no actual higher purpose. Like they come together and they hug one another, but it's very obvious that even in that hug, that she thinks that she's hugging Baku,
Yeah.
and this isn't going anywhere good. And then 5 years pass. This is kind of the passage of time. They're living in an apartment together. They have a cat together. They have like it seems like a perfectly a good life in that sense, right? But there's always this thing bubbling under the surface. She meets her friend from Osaka again,
Yeah.
and she tells her, "Oh, you didn't know that Baku is, he's like a
Celebrity.
famous,
Yeah.
he's like a famous actor and model now." And she sees him, and that's kind of like another kind of thing. That's like another thing that's supposed to give like faux depth to Osako. Oh, she's not the type that pays attention to mainstream movies, mainstream
Yeah.
magazines, commercials. She doesn't look at any of that.
Yeah.
She doesn't listen to mainstream music. She's so in her own world. But obviously, like, where else would she get all this like stuff in her head about like what
Yeah.
love ought to look like? She must be picking it up from these kinds of like cultural cues, right? That are very like not deep. So anyway, she realized like, oh my God, Baku's still around, and now he's famous, and this attraction comes even more so, I think, probably. And that's the other thing, like, to the
Yeah.
extent that she's portrayed as almost kind of like an animal like reactive figure, she must be like extra turned on that now he's like rich and famous, right?
Yeah. She like when she finds out that he's in town, and she
Yeah,
just becomes like this is a hilarious moment where she basically like she hears he's in town, she runs, and her friend's like,
yeah,
no, don't do it. She literally runs there,
yeah,
and she just becomes she's indistinguishable from another fangirl.
yeah,
She does that moment where she's waving at his car, and
mhm,
that's when that's how he re-enters her life,
yeah,
because he notices her and then shows up at her door.
yeah,
But she slams the door, she runs, and she like literally like covers her head
mhm,
because but of course she's
yeah,
still it's very much attached to him. And when Baku does return again in the dinner scene, like you're never in doubt as to what she will do when he
yeah,
offers this hand, and they run off together, um, which is basically the ending of the film where Asako basically abandons Ryohei. They go off to the sea, right, or to Baku's parents'
yeah, like
home.
very, very, very
Yeah,
north. Yeah,
yeah, and again he's like he's basically the same person. He looks different because
mhm,
he's become a actor slash model now. But like you said, he's just this completely emotionless, cold mannequin. And of course and she regrets again that she she went to go with him and she waffles. And after doing
Yeah.
that text, she says, "Oh, actually, like I want to go back." And
Yeah.
no visible effect on him. She's like, "Okay." Also
Yeah.
in the car scene, she says, I guess it's supposed to be related to the original Japanese title. She's like, I felt that everything before this point was like a dream.
Yeah.
And now I'm finally awake, but it was a
Yeah.
good dream. And I suppose it's supposed to make the viewer feel sort of like some kind of sadness or melancholy for the life she'd left behind, but all it does is make us feel like she's delusory
Yeah.
about what life she'd been leading. And in the very end, before she leaves Baku, goes back to Ryohei and is basically like just screaming at him like, "Hey, Ryohei, accept me again."
Mhm.
And of course, understandably, he's like, "I don't want anything to do with you. Like, you completely trashed our relationship that we
Mhm.
built and ran away with this dude that looks like me, your ex, basically." Um, and then, but ultimately, he gives in
Mhm.
inexplicably, or I guess because
Well,
he loves her.
do we actually know that he gives in?
Well, he at least lets her back into their home, and he
Yeah.
reveals that he didn't actually give away their cat,
Yeah. Yeah.
which he's
Yeah.
lying
That's
about.
like the soft ending. Yeah.
Yes. And then he lets her back in, and then they basically have this moment where they calm down, and he's like, he doesn't say that they're going to be together again exactly or explicitly, but then he's like, after this, I'm never going to be able to trust you.
Mhm.
And she's like, "Okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
fine. And also, like, I'll learn to
Yeah.
stop
What a
leaning
nice
on you."
basis for a relationship.
Exactly.
You know?
So, if they probably won't last, but and the very end is them at the balcony of their apartment in Osaka, and they're sort of overlooking the landscape. I wrote in my review that it's wintry, but I think I may have been mixing it up with Drive My Car. I don't know what the weather's like, but they're overlooking the river, and she's like, "Oh, this river, it's," or she says something, or no,
No.
Ryohei goes, "This,
Yeah.
what a
Yeah. He
filthy
says yes.
river," and then Asako, the very last words of the film are her lines. She's like, "But it's beautiful." And then the film ends. And well,
Yeah.
they exchange these enigmatic glances, or he looks at her, and then the film ends. And of course, it's, I mean, my interpretation of it is, um, has to do with her character, something like that. Like
Mm.
she's beautiful, but her actions are filthy, quote
Mm.
unquote.
Yeah, because she says so twice in the
Yeah,
film, right? One
yeah,
time she says like, when she sees that early friend like that's paralyzed, like, oh, I only can think about myself. And then during the
yes,
dinner,
yeah,
she's like, I behave badly,
yeah,
I am bad. Like she's just says like random, like I am bad, like
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
Um,
um,
and it's, one can read it as like about the film being about how she can only focus on the superficial aspects of life and can never
mhm,
really go deeper or focus on what actually matters. That being Ryohei's dependability, him being a good person over, the sort of animal attraction she has with Baku.
mhm,
Um, and then it just kind of ends. And of course, the lines are completely cliched. And I mean, it's not the worst moment. It's not the worst ending you can think of, but it's still, it just really comes off as uh, incredibly cliched and not a
yeah,
good ending. But
yeah,
and yeah, that's
and
the end of the 2 hour affair. Is those two lines?
and the
Yeah,
thing is, uh we are supposed to sort of think like, oh, we technically don't know whether or not they could last
yeah,
together, right? All of that, but the fact is, I think like there's this kind of like strain in both films, right, where kind of
yeah.
like love is supposed to be all revealing, all
Yes,
illuminating, all forgiving, right? And this is that kind of like weird Occidentalism that I alluded to earlier, where we're getting a lot of like, I wouldn't even say like typically Western, conceptions of love. Because I mean, if you go further back, I mean, like the ancient Greek conception of love and the Roman conceptions of love, they weren't necessarily all that positive.
yeah,
But it, like in the 20th century, right? Obviously, a lot of this shifts with the fact that you don't have to get married if you don't want to. You're more free to choose your partners. It's easier to find romantic love, and once that begins to happen, kind of, across all cultures really, but it's really kind of like a lot of, it's obviously a lot of American culture that changes a ton of what's going on in Japan, right? Because of World War II, because of the occupation.
Yeah.
And, eventually we start to like peak out in the 80s and 90s when it comes to that kind of thing. But these kinds of like Western notions of love start to infiltrate. But in this film specifically in Drive My Car, it's the most like trite versions of that, right?
Yeah.
It would be the equivalent of, imagine an Asian lady with the word water on her arm, and that's supposed to be like a deep, meaningful tattoo, right? In English, it looks stupid, right? And maybe in Japan, like the reason why, I don't know, in the 80s and 90s, this kind of thing started to be really latched onto the kind of like pop cultural stuff is because like maybe a lot of it was new, right? I mean, you still get obviously like more arranged marriages or like quasi arranged marriages in Japan now than you would in America, obviously, right? So you still have some of that sort of newness, I guess, with some of these like concepts of love or whatever. But it really is the most kind of trite version of it, right? So, like within the narrative of what's going on within the film, if love is treated in this way, it's supposed to be all illuminating and all forgiving. Even if like it's supposed to technically give you an open-ended ending, it's not truly open-ended, right? All the propaganda is set up so that you come to a different kind of conclusion, right? So let me see. Was there anything else to say about this movie? I mean, I would say there's a couple of like potentially good moments, but again, given that there's no actual payoff, I know you're not building towards anything. It doesn't matter, that even some of these moments exist, and to the extent that moments exist, you wonder how much of it is just like pure randomness because it's a couple of moments out of like a ton of like missteps, right? So I mean, you if you give an artist like enough space, right, they're going to eventually, even if they're just fucking around, they're going to fuck around enough where, haphazardly, something might come out. But anyway, we can move on to Drive My Car, which is, I assume the most viewers are the ones, this is the film that they're familiar with, right?
Probably.
Neither of us heard of this director until this movie came out and we started hearing about it.
So Drive My Car. It's actually this movie is like Asako I and II. It's based off of work of literature. Asako I and II was based off of a novel. I forget the author's name. But Drive My Car is based off of a book of short stories by Haruki Murakami called Men Without Women. It's right here. I believe this came out, let's see.
Like 2014?
Probably. Yes, 2014, and then the English translation came out 2017, something like that. And it's the title comes from one of the short stories, but it's based off of a number of them. And sort of like Asako I and II, there's not much happens plot-wise, but it's an incredibly long film. It centers on this theater director / actor named Kafuku, which is a play off of Kafka, who's a writer that Murakami is influenced by, and both have surrealistic aspects in their work. So it centers on this guy who's a theater director and actor. He's most notable for his plays, which are multilingual. They have multilingual casts. So you'll have multiple actors from different nationalities acting on the same stage, and they have the subtitles on like an overhead projector. And so, he's sort of like this artsy, daring maverick in the theater world, I suppose. And he's married to a TV screenwriter named Oto, who I guess can be kind of like the Asako equivalent almost. This very beautiful, almost ethereal Japanese woman.
The exception being that the difference being is that we see her also as extremely sexual, whereas like Asako is so sexless, right? She's supposed to be like the mystery.
Yes. And they have this what seems like a very happy, content relationship in this 45-minute long intro of the film. But then it's slowly revealed that she is unfaithful to him. She would have where it's revealed he comes back home after going on a trip or something, and he sees her having sex with this faceless dude, but we can assume is sort of like one of the young actors she works with. She's a TV screenwriter, and he says nothing about it because, for reasons later explained in the film. And they have this dynamic where there seems to be like one can tell that there's more underneath the surface. There's probably some unsatisfaction because she, like we mentioned earlier, she gets all her like screenplay ideas from, or story ideas, during like climax or after sex, where she will sort of regale Kafuku with these really odd stories, particularly about a girl who basically breaks into her high school crush's home and like uses his paraphernalia to get off and masturbate. Just really weird stories that are also based off of another story.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Like that initial framing, like one of the there's a few like thematic sort of like framing strategy structures. One of those is like everything is kind of like the backdrop. We have these Chekhov plays, but another thing is like we sort of like begin and end to some degree with Otto's sort of like story about what is the name of that boy, Yamuga or something. So it's basically like a story, right? And she's telling this story while she's like in the middle of sex, right? Which is like another layer of just like, it's just again this doesn't seem like it's like a normal part of Japanese culture, right? It seems like this is a highly specific niche, like when Westerners think of like, what is that like what is that, like a weebo or something?
A weebo.
Like they would sort of like imagine some of these kind of situations. So she's like in this hypersexual woman, and she's in the middle of sex, and she's saying this story about this girl, right? And she's a girl because it's just like a teenage girl, like a high school girl who becomes like infatuated with some like boy, right, in one of her classes or whatever. And she breaks into his house when there's like nobody home. And she goes into his bedroom every time, and she leaves like a token of herself every time. Sometimes it could be like an unused tampon, right? Or it could be like eventually like she leaves like a pair of panties or something. And one day she's like in her bed, and she's like, or rather she's in his bed, and she's like masturbating on the bed, and she hears like somebody coming upstairs. And the story ends there, right? And it's supposed to be this kind of like dramatic thing where, what happens next? Like, like as if you're like on the edge of your fucking seat, like that you would even care about this totally absurd, totally like out of the norm, absurd, just kind of like situations being described. And ultimately, so one of the actors that she's having sex with, that eventually stars in or wants to star in Uncle Vanya, that Kasuki, or rather Kafuki. Well, it's is it Kafuke, Kaf?
I don't know if it's
Ke.
I think it's Ku, but I could be wrong. Kafuku.
Well, I mean, some of these transliterations might be wrong, right? Because I saw the E, but maybe
it's probably that might be it.
Anyway. But anyway, like it's supposed to be like that Kafka illusion, right? So this Kifuki, so like he's told by this actor like, she did complete the story, and this is how it ends. And the way that story ends, and this is like supposed to be like the capstone. This is supposed to be how this like big like 3-hour film draws to a conclusion. And the conclusion is the man that's coming upstairs is actually an intruder, right? He's a burglar, and he sees her, and he tries to rape her, so she takes like a penknife and kills him. And she and she feels like very guilty about this killing. So eventually she like goes to a security camera in front of the house, and she confesses to it. And it's like that's the fucking like wonderful, mysterious, like playwright wife, right? This is her internal kind of artistic mystery, right? This is the edge of your seat cliffhanger that she leaves her husband with before dying. And it's so like, again, like, so literally all you have left then is that hyper like sexual sort of animal like quality to her.
Yeah.
And the funny part is like, so you first mentioned the Orientalism when you were talking about your viewing of Drive My Car, and I saw how this applied actually to both films. But I was like, all right, let me see what Zeke means in terms of like what some of the reviews say about Drive My Car. And this is like one of the things that I came across. This was in the Sydney Morning Herald. This is a white guy writing this review, and this is how it ends. Um, the acting is another of the deep pleasures. This is a film of great physical and visceral pleasure, despite all the sadness. The characters speak only when they have something to say. There's little small talk. There's a lot of silence too, which scares most filmmakers. Only the brave know how to use it. That's partly a Japanese thing. Gesture. Gesture and negative space carry great weight. A passionate kiss between husband and wife implies meaning. The Japanese, for most of their history, did not openly kiss. Thus, this is a modern couple, right? It's late in the film before anyone bows, yet one of the most important moments comes when one character bows so deeply to another in a gesture of great power. After 3 hours, I felt like watching it again. It's that good. Yeah, that is very that's the thing. It is such like overt Orientalism, but because it's in the service of praising a multicultural film, everyone is willing to like pass over that a white guy is saying that. This kind of shit. And this kind of like thing about like a modern Japanese couple, it's very funny to read because like if you read Tanizaki's Some Prefer Nettles, which I believe it was like published either in the 50s or the 60s or the 40s. And it depicts a modern Japanese couple, right, in the 20s, right? Also with like these, sort of American culture and just like Western culture in general, already like permeating. And in Tanizaki's novel, they have like an open marriage. The wife is like constantly sort of like, going out, seeing a lover, perhaps seeing other men as well. And the husband has more or less accepted this, but there's so much more like psychological richness behind it. This dynamic really does get examined in a very, very peculiar way, a very particular way. Mm-hmm. Like early on, when the book opens, you see she's like the wife is getting ready to go out somewhere, but she's not actually sure. Like, should I go out? Maybe I will, maybe I wouldn't. And they have like so much time, like they're sort of like sitting around, and she's taking a long bath. He's kind of like reading pointlessly, like without a real reason. And you could tell like eventually, like a few pages in, you start realizing the conflict is, they've never totally gotten over this discomfort that she goes out and she sees other people, and he perhaps goes and he sees other people himself. And it's characterized as they are balancing like a basin of water, right, between one another, hoping that it doesn't spill over, right? And that's such an apt and perfect description for what's going on in the text. And here, like you don't get any of that. Like someone just calls this a modern marriage, but there's nothing particularly modern about it other than the fact that they clearly don't communicate at all.
Yeah.
Right. They don't really know, it seems like, almost anything really about themselves, about each other. And I'm not sure like how different this is from like a typical Japanese marriage, but this strikes me as Orientalism in a way that's like no different than either the self-Orientalism or the kind of reverse kind of Occidentalism that happens to and fro these films. So I found it like an interesting little thing. And you said that other parts of like when you were reading reviews, you noticed the Orientalism specifically among the reviews. Like what did you see?
I probably should have researched more, but I don't know. It's like, I think it's just because people have this idea of the Japanese, like I mentioned in my Asako review, of like having these sort of like spare static framing. There's, like silences. There's it's very relaxed pacing. And this is, something that you'll get in a lot of the Japanese classics, like, which I've only seen like a couple from Kurosawa. I've seen Tokyo Story. But in any case, that's sort of like those are like the classical features of these movies. And so, you'll get some of that in Hamaguchi's films. It's really relaxed. It's really long. the pacing sort of goes at its own pace, the static framing, and so I think people just see that and they imbue depth into it,
Yeah.
purely by virtue of those elements.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the meta things, and we haven't really gone into much of the plot of the movie, but I don't know. I noticed that in some of the reviews where like that one guy, like the guy you read, it's like it's very Japanese, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so if we're thinking that these characters aren't very deep, or their characters aren't, or they're not being explored, their dynamics aren't being explored in any way, it's because it's just that they do things differently over there. So we have to
Yeah.
kind of like
Yeah.
we have to
And,
forgive some of these,
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the irony. Like, again, back to Tanizaki, like when you read like some Prefer Nettles, the most striking thing is how kind of, outside of like what you mentioned, like the kind of like slow pacing, the build up, the kind of like give and take, that is, I'd say, like very classically sort of like, Asian literature, not just Japanese, but Asian literature in general tends to have, some of that, aesthetic kind of decision making.
Yeah.
But the very striking thing about Some Prefer Nettles is how utterly un-Japanese it is, how like totally just modern psychologically, so like it's so easy for a Westerner to read and totally understand, right? And you get the sense, okay, so if this is a book that's written in the 40s and 50s or whatever it was, to have this, just display this kind of like modern sensibility, that is the striking part, actually, right? It's not this other stuff that's being talked about. And specifically in that book, like, so to compare it to driving my car, so like when he sees for the first time that, there's this actor that was brought into his house and she's having sex with this, because like, so he misses like a flight. He's supposed to be going to, I believe it's like to Vladivostok, right? So he misses the flight to Vladivostok, and then he's just like, he's just in there, coming back home, and he sees his wife, and the depth that we're supposed to view is, he sees them and he says nothing, and we hear nothing about this until like an hour and a half later into the film, right? Whereas like in Tanizaki, you see like a rich characterization of the husband, right? Where he's like talking, for example, to one of his friends or relatives, I forget who it was, and the relative says something like, you keep searching and building up this perfect woman, and you have to understand that people like that don't exist. And he describes like what he wants, like he wants a sort of like almost like virginal type figure with something of the courtesan in her, right? And then like the friend just scoffs. He's like, "What are you even talking about? This is totally, like what exactly are you looking for, right?" And you get this by imbuement. You could sort of like imagine that maybe this is what this playwright, or rather this like play director, wants, right? He wants like somebody like her who has this kind of like artistic quality, but also has something of the courtesan in her, which is why he doesn't like say anything about it, right? But like you're just left, it's just literal guesswork. None of this is really built up. And it is funny how like after he comes home and he sees his wife is dead, that's like 45 minutes in, and then
45 minutes,
and that's when the credits start rolling in. It's like, okay, so like close to a third of the film is over already, and yet there's like nothing of any real substance that's been revealed, right? That's like that should be immediately a red flag, an alarm bell to anyone that's like, that's watching this movie.
Like we learned that they had a child who died, and so that points to there being some undealt with trauma in their relationship that leads them to not be able to communicate with each other. But so, and then like last moments of that intro is, it's also exposed that he something's wrong with his eyes, so he can't drive properly, so she has to drive him everywhere.
Which is another, like, would you think of that as a symbol? Like,
it's a little obvious. But I think, but that was like a lot of this, like one of my main points in the essay is that I don't know how much, like a lot of this stems from the source material, like a lot of the problems from the Murakami stories. So I don't know how much I can pin on Hamaguchi, but anyway, so he can't drive himself, and that's one thing that gets introduced in the intro. And then the other is that but right before she dies, Oda's like, "Hey, we need to talk when you get home." Obviously,
Mhm.
they're probably gonna like have some kind of important discussion, and he's like, "Okay." And then when he gets home, she has a brain hemorrhage out of nowhere, and so she's dead. And then
Yeah, and it's kind of implied
yeah,
that maybe he comes home late because he's not looking
yeah,
forward to this
yeah,
discussion, right?
yeah,
So that's the thing. Like you get like those little kinds of like little hints, but and I mean, like you could get a lot of great characterization just by these kinds of hints, but you need something else going on with like the interpersonal interactions,
yeah,
some other pointing to some other kind of depths within these characters. But so far, like all you get is this kind of like forced sort of stuff. Like, okay, so we know there's a dead daughter. We
yeah,
know that maybe he's sort of like, skipped going home early and possibly like led to her death by not being there early enough, right? Maybe there's like some guilt, related to this kind of thing, but like the point is like the choices leading up to, like, for example, like why did he not want to come home earlier? Let's say it's
yeah,
because he thinks she's gonna like start admitting to all these affairs or whatever it might be, right? But you would need you would need something between them to have been built up already in those 45 minutes before that would have like potentially some kind of payoff. And the fact that we don't get that,
yeah,
that's just becomes a means of like trying to force not the characters forward, but really just the plot forward, right?
yeah,
So it becomes very much a kind of like plot driven film that is dependent on some of these other like little like techniques. Like, okay, we
yeah,
have the early story of masturbating in the bed thing, and then we have the Uncle Vanya framing and all this other stuff, and we have the driving and silence framing. So
yeah,
and all those things also become almost purely plot devices as opposed to anything else.
yeah. Yeah, and so after the intro, it's basically the next 2 hours is basically Kafuku going to Hiroshima to direct Uncle Vanya, and he has his cast, and one of them who's playing Uncle Vanya is the sort of like teen celebrity, or not teen, but like good-looking male actor who probably was was having an affair with Otto. Um, and so he does the play, and he has to be driven around by this really, again, really laconic, unemotional young woman named oh god, what's her name? Uh, Masaki.
Yeah, Misaki, I think is her name. Yeah.
Masaki, yeah, she's the driver, and basically, it's the rest of the movie is about them, Kafuku, trying to come to grips with Oto and their relationship, and there's this annoying thing of like there being this like unpassable divide between man and woman, and like we'll never really know each other because there's this opaque like dark swirl
Hmm.
that that's in each of us that cannot be ever understood, so we have to be just content with what we can understand and be happy with the love that we have, um, through this lack of communication, which I guess is the overriding uh, theme or metaphor
Yeah,
in the movie.
which is why we
Yeah,
have like this weird thing going on with how are we gonna do the stage direction here? Oh, I know. We're
yeah,
going to have Uncle Vanya be, played with like 3 or 4 different languages, and
yeah,
everybody's
yeah,
like talking to each other in different languages, and the only way that the audience knows what's being said is because we have like
yeah,
subtitles for everything, right? Which is like it's such a ham-fisted symbol of like,
yeah,
it's difficult to communicate. Yeah, that's not to say that there's nothing that comes of it. Like there is that interesting scene where like they're in the park and they're playing out one of the parts, and then you have the deaf woman, and they seem to have like a very nice interaction there. But again,
yeah,
it's not nothing is really done with it. It doesn't carry. It's not carried anywhere. It doesn't really unfold or go anywhere.
yeah,
But just like as a frame, this whole idea of we're gonna have this kind of play done in this kind of way, just very kind of just very ham-fisted. And it reminds me also kind of like what happens with like the worst of like modern uh like stage acting. Like I
yeah.
remember like a while ago I went to see this live play rendition of Scenes from a Marriage.
I remember
And
your
I'm
essay
yeah,
on
yeah.
it.
I wrote about a website, and
Yeah,
I mean it like scenes from like Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage is in some ways like a perfect movie to put into play form, because everything is mostly two characters
Yeah.
and that kind of thing. But there was just like what they did was like they had like three sets of different actors, and they all have they're all like playing out this like marital disharmony or whatever. And everything just sort of comes to a fore where they're all acting simultaneously, and it's supposed to be so like we don't understand each other.
Yeah.
But again, it's too ham-fisted, it's too over the top, right? This is bad symbolism. There's no point to like fuck with a film like that in such a way to make like a great film with something totally imperfect, right? Or here, you take Uncle Vanya, which like
which I should say they focus on the like they don't even get into like the best parts of Uncle Vanya, which is the
they have the melodrama,
yeah, exactly. So yeah, basically the 2 hours is them staging the play, and so there's two dynamics. There's Kafuku and Takatsuki, who's a young actor, and they both have this. We're not sure if Kafuku is genuinely trying to get to know Takatsuki, to befriend him and like be a good director of the play, or if he's trying to somehow like fake a friendship to really to get at Takatsuki in revenge for them having an affair. But they're both trying to grapple with who Oto was and is. Their one common denominator, apart from the sexual relationship, is Oto would tell both of them the story about the home invader. And like you said, the big reveal, there's this long monologue where Takatsuki reveals that in fact she gave him the ending to that story that Kafuku never got, and it's about like the rapist and her killing the body, and the body, it like her never being really like found out, right? And it just sort of ends, and then he's just sort of like gives up, like they just shrug it off, like, well, we can never really know who Oto is. We just have to be grateful for the love that we had for her. Years that you shared. And then it's like, this is supposed to be some kind of epiphany, I suppose, for Kafuku, but it just comes off as so like it's just wan. There's nothing there. And then the other dynamic is Kafuku and Masaki, who is his driver. And they both are dealing with this unexplored trauma. There's Kafuku with Oto, and there's Masaki with her mother, and the unhealthy relationship she had with her, and the fact that she had died in an accident, and she feels guilt because she didn't help her out. But like it's in that relationship, like they're probably really good actors. I haven't seen them in anything apart from these movies, but the performances are just so dull. And Misaki in particular is just this completely, like, to the point of a caricature of her being
she literally not once smiles at all in the film until the final scene where it's like, oh, finally the both of us are over this kind of trauma. I can smile, and it's like that is also just so unbelievably ham-fisted that I wonder if it's like that in the Murakami story. Honestly, it wouldn't even surprise me, because when you were doing your review, I even forgot that I had reviewed that Murakami novel.
The Colorless.
I don't even remember like Colorless, like something in his like Years of Pilgrimage. And honestly, like I literally like I completely don't even, I wouldn't even tell you what the book is about now. I read the book, I reviewed it, but at this point, everything I've forgotten. And I read something else by him. I think it was the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. Also, virtually nothing that I remember about it. And it's weird. Like in a lot of like Japanese, like you don't have the same thing as like you have in America, where like we have this like total fixation on like like superhero films and like shit like that, right? There you have that kind of outlet through some of the kind of like like bigger anime series. But instead, what happens is you have like these totally kind of like token people and relationship and existences, like in the Asako film, or also this, that are like blown up into like totally, it's so dramatic and it's so revealing and it's so rich and it's so deep, right? And he himself, right? Hamaguchi says that he's very much influenced by John Cassavetes.
I was going to say,
right. So like he's trying to sort of like say like, oh, there is like something within this banality, but just like with the Marvel movies, like by blowing up into this very like big thing. It doesn't really do anything except like the blow up. Here, you blow something up into this big thing that's supposed to have like an emotional resonance that we're not actually getting. And also, like, I'm not sure if the implication in the end scene is that the driver is now in a relationship with.
I think it's just that Kafuku is so grateful for how she helped him work out through,
or maybe just gives the
trauma.
car, you know.
He just gives her the car, and she ends up with the dog. That I think the one smile we see is that when they go over to the couple's house and they have a nice dinner, she plays with the dog, and so there's some
that's
so the very ending is her basically. It's like, you know, it's all very banal. Most of this movie, because the ending is just that she's just getting groceries. She's got the car. She's got the dog. We assume Kafuku's happier now. He's gifted her with this car that she's so good at driving, and you know, it's just, I don't know. It just ends like that, and the story is not even. I mean, the story's, I would say it's better because it's shorter, because like all the problems of Murakami are cut down on because of the length of the short story. Like in the novels, it's worse because there's so much time, or there's so much space to mess up. But yeah, the story is basically sort of has the same themes of her being such a good driver that he's able to kind of like filter the world out because of her skills and making her driving so well. And she sort of gives, oh, well, we'll never know, you know, we'll never know someone's reasons for doing what they did to us. We just kind of have to move on with our life.
Yeah.
And then that's the big emotional payoff for Kafuku, is that he's like, we just have to go on. We just have to move on when people die and they hurt us, but you know, life goes on. And then they cry, and it's like,
like I said, like both films have this like very weird emphasis on you know, like redeeming the female characters, and here like it seems even it's like much more I don't want to say like it's more or less justified, but it's kind of like even weirder, right? Because it's like everybody here wants to get to the bottom of like Oto's like internal secret, but it's like a secret based on what? Like she's clearly not a talented writer, right, in any kind of way. And but that's the thing, like to an average like audience goer, right, to a movie goer, right, they might be like, oh yeah, that is an interesting story. There's a masturbating teenage girl, and her crush is bad, and she kills a burglar. You know, like what the fuck? Like a burglar happens to show up, you know, in Japan of all fucking places, and now there's this murder that, you know, almost never will you find a murder in Japan, but this is the kind of murder that occurs, right, in this like totally like dramatic way. So it's like there's not actually anything to uncover, right? There's nothing, anything about, and that's the thing. Like to the extent that there is anything to uncover, right? If we want to go back to this like thing of Orientalism and these kinds of readings, it has to be the fact that, you know, Oto is good looking, and I fucking get it. You know, like if you're like a white, you know, a moviegoer and you see like a hot Asian girl, like I totally understand that. But if this is really like your only attachment, this is where you latch on to, like imagine if she was ugly, right? There would be we have to get to the bottom of this, guys. Like you have, you know, the husband who feels like, you know, emotionally destroyed by the wife. You have her extremely young lover who's like, yeah, I get to fuck a MILF, right? And then you have like all these other people, like, and they're all responding to like her physicality. And not just like physical in terms of looks, but like the fact that she's so hypersexual, and everybody's obsessed with like redeeming her. Like first it's like, you know, it's the Uncle Vanya actor, right, who ends up like, you know, being I guess jailed. Probably
he beats a paparazzi guy to death.
He's not even a paparazzi guy, he's just like some random guy who's like has like and that's the thing, like that's supposed to like demonstrate how he's, and that's the thing, like when you see that actor in any other context, he's just kind of like, you know, he's like polite, semi-normal, but like he's supposed to have this like edge to him where like he secretly beats people, or he like starts like affairs with people. But you know, there's also nothing really of substance about him. But like anyway, so this character, he's obsessed with like in the car, right, when they're having that conversation, like, I really, like I really think that she loved you, like, and there's all these mysteries, blah blah blah. Then you have the driver, and she starts to like totally like insinuate into this, like, I think you have to understand that, she loves you anyway. There's this depth, and we can never know, blah blah blah. And then he himself starts saying, like, she betrayed me in all these like ways that are like very natural to her, right? And but she still loved me, and it's like that's a like for these are people that they're not teenagers, right? They're acting like teenagers, but these are supposed to be like very mature loves. These are supposed to be long-term marriages, and yet they are thinking about each other, and they're thinking about love, and they're thinking about human emotions in very, very childlike ways. That just, there's no action. Like if you're someone that's looking for a mature, Japanese Tanizaki type drama, which again, like I would urge anybody that's like so into this film, they're shocked that we could be saying such a thing about it. Go to the library and get Tanizaki's Some Prefer Nettles. A very similar kind of dynamic is going on. There's also very much a kind of like open-ended ending to the book, and just compare the internal psychological richness and how these situations, some of them are a little bit similar, how they get set up, what the payoff is, why it's going on. Some of these characters that are like supposed to be stock characters that are given depth later, here they're just stock characters from beginning to end, right?
And it's not like it's an uninteresting thing to explore. Like there are limitations to our subjective experience. We can't really know what even our most intimate relationships, the people in our most intimate relationships, what they really, really think, right? Like that's something that can be explored. But what Hamaguchi rests on are like just the most cliched conclusions of like, a tearful embrace in the snow, of them having to get over death, or with Uncle Vanya, like the ending of Uncle Vanya has Sonya saying like, oh, like there will be paradise after our struggles, right? That's the closing monologue. But in the movie, it plays that. It has the deaf Korean actress signing the Sonya's final lines, and this is like raved about in reviews, like, oh, it's like the movie is worth this scene alone of this final ending. But but in the play, it's like there's this irony about it. Like Sonya is saying, oh, after all our struggles, there will be paradise and God will reward us. But Vanya is still counting off their like the finances, and there's this irony to it that like what she's saying she might not even really believe. But in the movie, it seems to be played off as if that's like it plays into the saccharine aspect of it. Like there will be comfort. There is, there, like, despite the darkness, there is a light, right? That's the cliche ending, which is how it literally ends. Like just happiness, like a reward, a final gratification after the struggles of these characters. And so like you have this interesting thing of there being a mystery to even our to the people we love, but then it chooses the most saccharine conclusions, So and the lamprey thing, it's like so the whole sex stories is based off of another short story in the book called Scheherazade. And Scheherazade, the classic story of this woman being forced to tell these stories for her own life, right? In her imprisonment. And I guess it's supposed to say that Otto feels imprisoned in this marital situation. None of them can be really honest with each other, so they have to resort to these sort of like really like badly written dream stories in order to explain or to confess their true feelings, or her true feelings at least. And the lamprey is like, so she's like extracting, she's leeching off of her husband and also the male actors she has sex with for her own benefit. And it's there's nothing really all that mysterious about it. Like so
except for that kind of former life lamprey, like it's only that Oriental sort of like
it's like odd
detail that like in and of itself, like there's no actual, you can't just invoke reincarnation, right? And then suddenly, oh my goodness, all this depth comes to the fore, right? That is total, and totalizing, kind of Orientalism.
Sure. I mean, and I was going to say earlier about like with Asako I and II, there's like a doppelganger device, right, with Baku and Ryohei. I watched to kind of like get a sense of how a better artist might use that device. I watched The Double Life of Veronique. Have you heard of that
Oh,
one,
yeah, I've seen
Kieslowski?
it a couple times. Yeah, it's probably my
Yeah,
favorite film of his. Yeah,
I watched that,
and there's
and there's
actual
also a
mystery
doppelganger,
there. There's so
and
much
there's
mystery there. Yeah.
exactly, and what he uses that device, there's like metaphysical implications to it. Like
Hmm.
nothing's really ever cleared. Kieslowski never explains why there's two versions of the same person living, like one in Poland and one in France. But he like
I think they are supposed to be twin sisters.
perhaps, but like he never says that,
What
right?
was that?
So
That's never made clear.
I don't think so. I just watched it yesterday. I could be wrong, but in any
Yeah,
case,
I've
there's
always
this,
assumed it, but maybe not. Yeah.
yeah, there's this kind of mystery about it, right? That he explores, and it's this very beautiful, sensual film um, that explores like that feeling of there being another you somewhere, and
Yeah,
it's not the
and
most common
even in the
feeling, but
sex scenes that comes out,
yeah,
they're kind of like filmed from this kind of like I forget the exact. It's some sort of angle. Through some kind of like translucent glass, like where
yes,
there's like
yeah.
distortions and there's
She has
clear
like a ball, yeah,
implications. Yeah, there's clear like implications for like fractioned personalities and that kind of
sure,
thing. Whereas
yeah.
here it's just kind of like it's like sex scenes for the sake of sex scenes.
Yeah, and it's for Asako I and II, the doppelganger is just like, oh, it's just this really banal story about emotional infidelity, right?
Mhm.
That's what he does with it, as opposed to what Kieslowski does with, or Kieslowski, or however you say it. But
Mhm.
anyway, I just wanted to mention that. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, and this got a lot. Drive My Car got basically catapult. He won the best international feature at the
yeah,
Oscars. I think
I
he's
saw that.
only him, Kurosawa, and Teshigahara.
Who
They're
did
the only
a
three.
Woman in the Dunes? Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
but I don't think it was for that. Maybe it was for that movie. I don't remember, but
Hmm.
yeah, but yeah, it's pretty. It is interesting again to see like when you read some of these reviews, you read between the lines. How much can you get away with like tokenizing and otherizing,
Yeah.
orientalizing, or like whatever, if it's like to a perceived service, right? If it's in the service of whatever is like happens to be a fad, whatever is considered okay, right? Like if you're sort of like propping up, like multicultural directors, you
Yeah.
could orientalize, you could do pretty much anything that you want, and no one is going to sort of think any less of you for it. In fact, they
Yeah.
won't even see it, right? And that's
Yeah.
the thing. I mean, even the director, right, and Murakami, like they're all complicit in this thing, right? They're giving you all of this stuff to extrapolate from, right? I mean, they're telling you like, oh no, she has so much stuff, she has that, she has it,
Yes.
has it,
Yeah. Yeah.
has it. But literally, all they do give you is the fact that she's beautiful, sensual, and highly sexual. That's all you get.
Yeah.
So I mean, you can't but imagine a bunch of like, the reviewer that I quoted is some like, advanced middle-aged guy in Australia or whatever,
Yeah.
who I'm sure, like a lot of these people have, these sort of, whether or not they would make a big deal of it. There's probably some sort of like fantasy thing going on.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, and there's nothing even necessarily wrong with that. But the fact is, it's like if this is all that the artist really gives you, right, I would expect a lot of like white Western men to have praise that whether or not they really it gets built up around this like, pearl of like like just pure physicality, which is, it's kind of sad, it's kind of funny. And
Yeah.
it's weird to know there's like so much complicity here, by everyone involved, right? This
Yeah.
isn't something that you could just blame on the reviewers.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you ever see Parasite? The
No,
Bong
I
Joon-ho?
haven't. We
Yeah.
probably should. We should probably watch more and more of these kinds of like viral films and just like
Yeah.
review them. But I'm sure it's not any good. But, like, what about it?
No, I was gonna say it was similarly like, it's not like a terrible film, but I thought it was really overhyped, and I think it got a lot of um, praise simply because Western audiences, or maybe a lot of them, are just encountering um, this Korean auteur for the first time. So when they
Mhm.
see this Korean film, if it were made by an American and the same story, it probably would not get the same treatment, but
Yeah.
there is this sort of like almost condescending praise it gets because it is foreign and exotic.
Yeah.
And that won the best picture, not even best international feature.
Mm-hmm.
Parasite won, took home the big prize. But yeah, or even like I remember reading reviews for the Makoto Shinkai Your Name film, and it was like, you know, typical anime stuff. It was very beautiful. The animation was really good, but I remember like a Roger Ebert article about it. Not him; he'd been dead already, but one of his reviewers praising it for all its qualities, which were, you know, kind of like puerile, and you
Yeah.
know. But if it were an American film, I'm sure they would see through it. But
There's also this one review that I pulled up. This was somewhere on the Roger Ebert site. What was it? Let me see. So yeah, so like what do you think about this? Like they were describing some of the symbolism here. Bountiful and subtle imagery from cinematographer Hidetoshi Shinomiya. The film mines majestic visual symbolism from seemingly ordinary occurrences. Take, for example, a shot of Yusuke and Misaki's hand through the car's sunroof, holding cigarettes as to not let the smoke permeate their sacred mode of transportation, an unspoken communion of respect, right? And this was like a common like motif, like they would constantly be like lighting up cigarettes, right? Which in a because like cigarette smoking is progressively less and less popular in the West, while it's still like pretty popular in Japan, and still pretty popular in a relative sense in like Korea and stuff like that in China. So like it's like a constant motif. They're like constantly lighting up, and that's supposed to be receding into their own thoughts, right? And yeah, like I like there would be reviewers that would watch this. Oh, look, now you know they're trying not to like fill up the car with smoke. It like it didn't strike me as necessarily symbolic something, because like it was just kind of like so obvious. It's like, yeah, if you have a fucking car, like why would you want to fill it up with smoke? You know, like it's just what you're gonna be driving and both of you are gonna be smoking, and you're gonna light up more cigarettes. Like you're gonna die of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Lost you
So
for a second. Sorry.
that's all right. So yeah, like you know, it's like focusing always like on the wrong shit, you know.
Yeah, I think that was right after the monologue with Takatsuki, and so like there's this release, and they talk about it, and she's like, oh, you know, there's something there to what he's saying, like like he's really genuine, and then they have the cigarettes on the. I mean, I get it. Maybe like, you know, it's a nice framing, it's a nice shot of the two hands together, but it's I don't know. It's just more imbuing depth where it's not present. Yeah, like their growth is just they just sort of like they talk to each other, and then they reveal things about themselves, and she learns more about him and Otto because he listens to recordings of Otto going through the lines of Uncle Vanya, and then, you know, she likes her voice and she feels that some connection to the play, but like there's no connection. There's no real sense of their becoming close with each other because one, the Masaka character, the driver, she's completely stilted, and there's just no real ounce of human feeling. And Kafuku's not much better, right? I mean, the most emotion we see from him is when he's acting, and there's supposed to be some kind of like cathartic release for him, right? Because he's gone through these things and he's learned more about Otto through Takatsuki. And when he, you know,
what exactly does he learn is the thing, right? What does he learn? He learns the conclusion to that totally idiotic story, right? And he learns maybe more about her infidelities.
Sure. Or he learns to let go and not to try to like uncover what her motivations
don't try to
are,
understand,
right?
you know, again, like it's this thing, like love is supposed to be all revealing, all illuminating, all forgiving, and there's no actual reason for thinking that, for assuming that. It's just there, right? And that aspect is perhaps less orientalizing and more, you know, an example of like Occidentalism, right? I can imagine this being especially the thing that like tons of like, you know, Western types view when it comes to love. Facebook memes going around, like, I like one common one. I remember like back when I was like in like early college, like there'd be like, women in their early 20s and they'd be like posting shit like your 20s are supposed to be a decade for you to be selfish, do everything, experience everything, travel everywhere, break people's hearts, like shit like that. And then ultimately you're supposed to be, come back to it and be redeemed by love, right?
Yeah.
Maybe like transplanting this into the East, right? It's supposed to give it some kind of a veneer of depth, right? But again, it's the equivalent, it's the reverse example of an Asian woman with a tattoo that says water in English, right? It's just stupid.
Yeah.
And
the Chekhov thing adds nothing.
You were mentioning earlier that basically like the focus on Chekhov is specifically the more like melodramatic aspects of the play. I recently listened to that play in the last few months. Honestly, I wasn't even that. It wasn't really that impressive. I've always preferred Chekhov's short stories, like like 1.5 pages of just like you capture like something really psychologically rich. Like I remember one story where there's a guy that there's a husband and wife, and he believes that he has won like the lottery, and he starts looking at his wife, and he says like, and she smells like a kitchen, right? and like imagining everything that would happen after after they're able to get divorced, right? And it's just like a page and a half, but it captures a kind of like marital dynamic like perfectly. Whereas there is like more melodrama in Chekhov's plays, and it's kind of telling that this is what is focused upon in the film.
I will say I saw Mosfilm. There's a YouTube channel called Mosfilm.
The Russian.
They have a bunch of Russian movies for free on YouTube. So I watched. It was kind of like if Tarkovsky did Chekhov. The cinematography was very reminiscent of the Tarkovsky film. And you're right. I think he was a better short story writer. But like that scene with like Uncle Vanya is supposed to be this sort of impotent man child whose great moment is this sort of this like tirade against his father, or the father figure in his life, which he ultimately can't even grow from because he reverts to his servile state at the very end. But then in the movie, in Drive My Car, it's sort of played as this release that it means something, and is to Kafuku. And so like again, all the irony that redeems the melodramatic aspects in Chekhov's play is not played into in the film. It's taken for granted in Drive My Car. So I mean, I might be judging the movie for not for what it is, but for what I think it should be. But I don't know.
Yeah, but it's also what it's trying to be, right? I mean, we could tell what it wants, right? It wants to extract the like Chekhovian depth, right? And there's also this like in both movies there's a kind of like Chekhovian sort of a gun aspect where I forget exactly what it was in my notes. Maybe it was actually in my kind of raw notes, but there's like some parts where like you see like you see like an element in the film that's supposed to like presage what's going to happen next, but it's done in a way where like you get like with Chekhov's gun, like it's supposed to be this idea of something of substance is supposed to transpire, right? Whereas here we just get like some other thing transpires, and it's always like some other thing. It's not there's only forced closure. There's not anything more than that. But anyway, that's all I got to say about these films. We could end it here, or if you want to say something more, we could close out.
The one thing I will say, I know that there's something I find really annoying about the meta aspect, because it is a little meta, right? Because there's a play within a movie, and then Kafuku, when he's going through the lines, he would force his actors to remain as unemotional as possible during the reading, right? And when there is kind of an inflection, he'd be like, just read the lines as it is, and that will tell you more about the meaning than if you were to emote. And that's possibly some meta aspect of these characters being unemotive, and yet we're supposed to read emotion into their lines. But but the characters just come across as so stilted and dull and wooden that there isn't any payoff. But so I just was annoyed by that, and there's just this like kind of precious theater talk about how about like acting and all that, and I talk a little bit more about it in the essay, which people can read if you're curious. But that's all. It's
So this has been Artifact number 31, Hamaguchi and Orientalism, let's call it. So you guys should go to automachination.com, check out Zeke's essays, not only on these two films, but other films as well. And patreon.com/automachination if you want to listen to the patron-only conversation that Zeke and I are about to have. Again, it's going to be on the arts, subjectivity, objectivity. Maybe we're going to touch other things as well. On the way to get that, patreon.com/automachination. Hit like, hit subscribe, very helpful. If you don't want to help me financially, there's definitely other things that you could do. The simplest thing is to not only watch this, but to actually engage, leave a comment, tell other people about it. Tell them you're going to stop being their friends unless they sit through Artifact 1 through 31 consecutively without getting up to piss, without getting up to shit, without getting up to eat, without getting up to drink. Right. And that would be the basis for perhaps more intellectually stimulating friendships in your own life. So that is my advice to you. Thank you guys for watching, and patrons, we will see you very soon.